Hello, psychos, and welcome to the Unit 1 review. I'm going to take you through a crash course of this. I'm going to pause along the way to allow you to think about and see how you might answer some of these questions, kind of like a game show. Yeah, think of it that way. And I'm your host. So, Unit 1 review. Let's see. In this unit, we've covered, a lot of interesting things about the history and the perspectives and theories of psychology and the different branches and subfields. And then social psychology, which, brought up some controversial kind of experiments, particularly with the ethical issues and such. And certainly research design. That's a big part of this one. So, let's just dive in. Here are the basic perspectives in psychology. This is a little game we'll play. Those are your options on the left, those major theoretical perspectives you should definitely know thoroughly. And so on the right side, I'm going to project clues and see if you can guess which of the left options it is, starting with this. And the answer is, pause if you need to think about it longer, Gestalt. Perception of the whole. It's all about sensation and perception with Gestalt psychology. Next one. And the answer is biomedical. The biological or biomedical kind of physical explanations, neurological explanations of our behavior is a big one, a big trend in psychology recently. There's your clues. And the answer is functionalism. The first American school of psychology, they started the American Psychological Association. William James is the founder. It's a lot more practical. They did more than just laboratory work. And they emphasized the functions or purpose of consciousness. As you move up the ladder there, you get to self-actualization, finding meaning and expressing your highest potential. And that is humanist or positive psychology, which also includes kind of existential kind of concerns. Next. All of those are clues for cognitive. Remember, cognitive was a sort of revival of interest in consciousness, but on steroids. They take it even farther. They see our brains, don't get cognitive confused with the biology of the brain. This is more of the software of the brain, like what it does, not really the physical aspects of the neurons. That would be more biomedical in that case. But cognitive is the processing of information, storage of memory, problem solving, decision making, and so on. And the answer to that is structuralism, the very first school of thought. Remember, in the laboratories, Wundt and others were having their subjects do introspection, looking inward and at their own conscious process to try to understand the structures of consciousness. They wanted to make an empirical or evidence-based science called psychology. And the answer to that is behaviorist. Behavioral psychologists are, definitely less concerned with consciousness. They don't care about cognition or thinking, and certainly not about the unconscious. They're all about manipulating the environment to manipulate the animal or person and their responses behaviorally. They're trying to get back to that empirical, evidence-based science, but in doing so, they rely only on behavior, not thought. Hopefully that one's pretty easy. A concern for the larger part of the iceberg below the surface would be psychodynamic, which, by the way, is a synonym for psychoanalysis or Freudian psychology. Dreams and such. Okay, did we miss any? No, okay, we're good. So, subfields of psychology. There are different branches, and here are your options. I'll let you pause the video, and your options are at the top. And now let's answer. Here is the key. So by gist, I mean psychologist are those with a PhD. or sometimes they call it a PsyD. You call them Dr. So-and-so, like Dr. Phil. He is a psychologist. He is not a psychiatrist. Sorry, a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist is somebody with a medical degree, a medical doctor who specializes in psychology. And because they're medical doctors, they can actually prescribe drugs. Dr. Phil is not a psychiatrist. Dr. Phil is a psychologist. He has a PhD from University of North Texas, actually, in psychology and counseling. And that is a different kind of doctor than a psychiatrist. Let's see, IO psychology, business. The largest subfield I'd like to emphasize is this one here. These are the ones, the clinical psychologists that diagnose and treat major mental illnesses. Now, they could be psychiatrists, but clinical psychology is the one that is going to be diagnosing major problems and helping people. Next. All right, this is big because I think I mentioned to you guys that the FRQs, the 2 FRQs you have on the national exam, they love that you understand research design, experiments and flaws and all the things that go with chapter, was that chapter 1? So you definitely want to really thoroughly understand this. So consider the advantages and disadvantages of each. So let me just throw some questions out at you. Which of these 4 types of research would have its greatest strength or advantage is control? That, of course, would be experiment. Which of these 4 has as its greatest advantage or strength depth of understanding of a particular subject? That will, of course, be case study. Which of these 4 would have its greatest strength or advantage? It's how people typically behave. That it would be naturalistic observation. And which of the 4 is broad reaching? It gets a greater sense of how the larger population behaves, and that would be survey. So surveys, my dog's snoring, hey hush. Okay, so survey is generalizable to the larger population. You get a good sense of how Americans think or behave, or humans or teenagers or whatever the larger population you're trying to generalize to. The disadvantage, though, of survey is that even though it's broad-reaching and generalizable to a large population, it's not very deep. You know, you're not getting deep, detailed information about each and every subject, although you're asking perhaps thousands of people. Case study is depth. It's kind of the opposite. So you get deep, detailed understanding of a particular individual, perhaps, but you're not getting, with that one, you're not really getting like broad reaching. You can't generalize the results of a case study to the larger population really very well. So yeah, depth, but not breadth of information from a case study. Now naturalistic observations are great because they are how people typically behave, and because they don't know they're being watched very often. You're kind of spying on them. The problem is you're not controlling anything. Who knows why they're behaving the way they are? You're just observing from afar, like a fly on a wall. So that's where experiments come in. It's controlling variables. But the problem with an experiment, the disadvantage there is if you're controlling and contriving a fake environment, it might not be naturalistic. It may not translate out to the real world with an experiment. But, you have more control. You also, with experiment, get closer to a direct cause and effect understanding of things. Oh, this variable is actually causing that variable, Whereas the first 3, and this is important, experiments are more causational. You get a direct cause and effect understanding in that link because you're tinkering and controlling things. The first 3 are more correlational studies. They establish that these things seem to be related or correlated, but that doesn't necessarily mean one is directly causing the other. Because remember, correlation does not necessarily mean causation. So these are correlational studies, whereas experiment is a little closer to causation because of its control. Let's see. There were some also disadvantages of the survey and some of the others. Things like the wording effect, the way survey questions are worded can sometimes be a problem. Even though they're anonymous, surveys can sometimes people answer in dishonest ways, like the social desirability bias, where they answer in a way to make themselves look better, more socially desirable, and they don't necessarily mean to do it like dishonestly. It's just kind of a thing. So social desirability bias. Another one is response set is another disadvantage of survey where people just answer without really thinking about the question, or they get stuck in a certain way of answering questions called response set. And that's a disadvantage of surveys. All right. Hey, dog, stop snoring. You, stop snoring. Okay. So here we have a shotgun of different vocabulary term related to research. So I'll just read out some questions and see if you can find the answer. Which of these that you see on the screen would be an APA ethical rule that says you're supposed to protect the privacy of your subjects? That would be, pause if you need to consider it longer. The answer to that is confidentiality. All right, which of these up here is the vocabulary term that means science should be evidence-based, not just using logic, but actually using proof of evidence? Answer, E for evidence, E for empiricism. All right, which of these up here is the safeguard that you use as a researcher to avoid your own bias from influencing your research? Because sometimes your own bias accidentally slips in there, and that's just not good science. The answer, to avoid experimenter bias, you would use a double-blind study. Not only do you leave your subjects blind as to what's going on and deceive them or not tell them too much, you also leave yourself blind as the experimenter until you've gotten all your results, just to avoid your own interpretation from influencing the outcome. Which of these up here is repeating a study to see if it's valid? And that would be replication. Which of these up here is APA ethical rule that says you must tell your subjects as much as you can without giving it away? And I should add, you must also get their permission. You can't coerce them with like holding a gun to their head to be in your research. And that would be informed consent. So inform them as much as you can, although you may want to still leave them blind. You may need to be some blindness there. But you must inform them as much as you can and get their consent. You can't coerce them. If you're a professor, you couldn't threaten to fail them in your class if they don't show up for your experiment. That's illegal. So let's see. Which of these up here, we might not have mentioned this, is a side-by-side comparison of different groups on some issue or variable? And that would be cross-sectional study. And another one we haven't mentioned, and we'll get to this later in the year, I just noticed they're up here. Another one is, instead of cross-sectional, which is a side-by-side comparison of, let's say, different age groups, 3-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 12-year-olds, side-by-side comparison in terms of their ability in some area. That's cross-sectional. Which of these up here would be the same subjects, though, over a long period of time as they grow up? That would be a longitudinal study over a long period of time. So it's not different people, it's the same people, the same subjects over a long time as they grow up. You're studying them in terms of the quality or trait that you're looking for. So different subjects compared side by side, whereas this is the same subjects over a long period of time. If we haven't mentioned that, that comes up later in the semester. All right, so which of these up here are things that slip into your research that might throw it off? That would, of course, be extraneous variables. Confounding variables are similar, but confounding, to be more precise, confounding variables are you've overly complicated your experiment with too many things going on, so it's confusing. Confounding variables confuse you when you get your results, whereas extraneous variables are things that are extra. They're extra or outside that slip in that you couldn't control out, and it throws off your results. Let's see. I think some of these others, we've mentioned along the way. Host institution is basically an APA rule that says that the host institution, which typically is the university, must give you approval before you go forward and start torturing people or whatever your experiment is, okay? So the host institution must grant permission, and the host institution is policed by the APA. Justification for animal harm is another APA rule that if you do, destroy brain tissue in rats or hurt anybody, it must be very much justified if any harm comes to anyone. So yeah, that's not everything, but that's just kind of a little sampling of research vocabulary. Let's move on to this. All right, I'm going to pause for a moment and let you see if you can fill in the blanks and answer these on statistics. Okay, so here's the answers to the presenting data and statistics. Random sampling is what you do here, not to be confused with random selection or a random assignment. That's different. Bell curve, hypothetical model. Mean is sometimes a problem if you have extreme scores that are extremely high or extremely low. Mean, the average will pull the average down or pull it up, which misrepresents the central tendency or what's typical or normal. So you would use mode or median. And this is an AP favorite. They like that you know that the standard deviation is that pattern of variation away from the center. So, and if you just remember that there's a formula for it, but our shortcut was just to remember that no matter what you're talking about on the bell curve, the standard deviation of IQ scores or SAT scores or shoe size or height or weight of the population, once you figure out the middle, which is the average or mean, you then plug in the formula, and it turns out that on any bell curve, 68% of the population, 34% this way and 34% this way, 68% will fall within one standard deviation. 95-ish% falls between -2 and +2. 99, like vastly most people in the population, will fall between -3 and +3 standard deviations of the average. So correlation coefficient is that tool that measures how strongly linked two things are connected, like smoking and heart disease, or stress level and alcohol consumption, or whatever. And because they seem to be correlated, but it doesn't necessarily mean one is directly causing the other. So correlation coefficient measures the strength of that relationship on a scale of -1 up to +1. If you recall, the closer it is to -1, that means that's a strong correlation in the inverse or negative relationship. So in other words, the closer it is to -1, that means when one thing is strong or high, the other one is dropping, it's low. It's an inverse or negative correlation. In the middle is 0, so it doesn't seem like they have any relationship. But on the other end of the scale, +1, the closer the correlation coefficient score is to +1, that indicates a strong positive correlation. When one thing is strong or high, the other one is high and strong, and vice versa. When one thing drops, the other one drops. Correlation coefficient. In this case, yeah, there's the answer. Tie, whereas, and then obedience would be the dependent. So I think that's it for that one. Let's see. Here's social psychology, and we're almost finished. Social psychology was the kind of last topic of the unit. And so here's your options on the left, a bunch of vocabulary terms related to social psychology. On the right, I'll give you a clue, and then I'll pause the video if you need to consider longer. But here is the answer. Who studied the 3 leadership styles? L for leadership, L for Lewin or Levine. Studied 3 leadership styles. The more people there are present, the less likely one receives help, and the answer is bystander effect. Hiding the true cost of something until later. So you're like, wow, what a bargain, and then you start to purchase it. The next thing you know, you're spending all these additional costs you didn't realize, but you still move forward. That's a persuasion tactic known as lowball tactic. Selling something by making it seem rare and precious. This is another persuasion tactic or a sales tactic called scarcity. By making things seem scarce or limited time only, or, get it while they last. People rush out and get it because it's scarce in time or quantity. Who studied obedience to unethical requests like pushing a button to shock someone in the next room. And that, of course, is Milgram. Saying it's just the way he is rather than it's just a bad situation he's in. In other words, you're blaming the you're blaming the person and not the situation. And that is fundamental attribution error. Remember, attribution is the way we attribute or explain people's behaviors in our brains. And the fundamental attribution error is an error in our judgment. We tend to blame them without considering the external situation. We downplay that. Repeatedly seeing a product makes you desire to buy it. Repetition makes us more attracted to certain things. And sometimes product placement tactics will use this, and it is the answer: mere exposure effect. A framework for understanding situations involving other people. And that is a framework of understanding is called, the answer, schema. So a social schema is a framework of understanding in which people are in, like certain stereotypical situations, like what you would expect from a first date or a job interview. You have certain expectations or sort of stereotypes in your mind of how that might go, and that is a social schema. The more people working on a task, the less effort each puts forth. Like doing group work at school, if there's 8 people as opposed to, say, 3 or 4 people, you find that each individual puts forth less effort. In other words, the answer, they are loafing more. So the more people you add to the group, sometimes you find there's more loafing. There's a division of responsibility. They sometimes call it a diffusion of responsibility in that case. That, by the way, that diffusion of responsibility also applies to the bystander effect that was mentioned earlier. How many people giving the wrong answer will cause one to conform? Who studied that? Answer: Ash. So Ash did the conformity where they had actors giving the wrong answer to the lines, if you recall, which were obviously the wrong answer, but the more people in the group that were giving the wrong answer, it caused this conformity. By the way, you might want to review the other factors from that chapter that contributed to the person conforming, like unanimity of the group. They all agreed on the wrong answer, and things such as that. The credibility of the people as well. Blaming a victim so that you will feel safer if in the same situation. So if something bad happens to someone, you're like, well, what an idiot. He shouldn't have been there in the first place or whatever. Well, by blaming him, the victim, you feel safer because you might be in the same situation. It's a way of making you're in your own mind, you might be lying to yourself. And that is defensive attribution. Remember, attribution is the way you explain things. In this case, you're explaining things like this guy's an idiot for doing that or being there, whatever the case is. So it's a defensive attribution. It defends you. It makes you feel safer psychologically. Overlooking evidence that would challenge our pre-existing beliefs. In other words, we notice what we want to notice while overlooking and ignoring and being blind to obvious evidence that would go against our belief. And that is confirmation bias. We have a bias to confirm our beliefs. We have it. That's why it's hard to argue with people sometimes. We have a bias to confirm our already existing beliefs. You could show people evidence all day long, but sometimes they ignore it, latching on to a few pieces of evidence that support their view. We see what we want to see. Believing it always rains the day after you wash your car. In other words, you wash your car and maybe it rains the next day. You're like, well, see, but maybe you wash your car at other times. You just don't even notice when it's perfectly fine the next day or two. Well, that is kind of like confirmation bias. It is illusory correlation, the illusion that two things are related. You're washing the car doesn't magically make it rain. You've developed an illusory correlation in that case. Liking someone who we think like us. Or it could be the opposite. If you think they don't like you, you find you don't like them either. Or we feel like if they give us something, we must return. And that's a sales tactic too. And it's called reciprocity. We reciprocate feelings. Maybe they really don't like us, but we think they do. In any case, we'll start liking them back. Or if someone gives us, does a favor for us or gives us something, we feel obligated to reciprocate. So sometimes salespeople will use a tactic like that. Withholding one's opinion for the sake of getting along with those others. And the answer, groupthink. Yeah. Dangerous things happen when everyone agrees sometimes. They all run off a cliff. When sometimes you really need to step back and not go along with the sheep. It's kind of like conformity, but it's like conformity of mind or opinion. Juries could sometimes fall prey to this. Persuasion with logic as opposed to emotional appeals. The answer, central route to persuasion and peripheral route to persuasion. Central aims straight for the brain. It's logical. It's fact-based. Whereas peripheral is outer and it's more emotional, or if it's a celebrity, or something like that, you feel like you want to vote for them or buy their product. It's not about fact in that case. Peripheral works faster. Central takes a little more time, but a combination of the two is best for persuasion. When small favors lead one to agree to a large favor. In other words, small yeses lead to a big yes. The answer, foot in the door. So the foot in the door tactic or the foot in the door phenomenon, when we agree to something easy, it makes it a lot easier for us to agree to larger requests or more difficult things. There's also the opposite. It's called the door in the face, which basically, if we ask somebody for the ridiculous, they're going to say no to it, but you ask them for, $1 million, you ask them for the ridiculous and they slam the door in your face, so to speak, you find that they might actually agree to the easier request after that. So it's the opposite. It's the door in the face tactic. They feel guilty for having said no, so they might go ahead and give in to the easier request. So coming from the opposite direction sometimes works in persuasion. This leads to the so-called Pygmalion effect or placebo effect. In other words, the power of expectation. If you expect something, it sometimes causes it to happen. If you believe a certain way, that belief subconsciously plays into your behaviors and can make it happen. And the answer is self-fulfilling prophecy. Prophecy is a prediction. So because you believe it's going to turn out a certain way, that's what causes it to actually turn out that way. It's self-fulfilling. So those are kind of interchangeable terms there, more or less. So the power of belief and expectation, and it's because you believe it that makes it happen. It's not for any other reason, really. If you didn't believe it, it probably wouldn't have happened. The longer people discuss an issue they already agree on, the more extreme that belief becomes. Answer, group polarization. Don't get that mixed up with groupthink, by the way. So whatever they agree on in the beginning, whatever their shared agreement or opinion is in the beginning, the longer they discuss it and pat each other on the back, the more extreme that opinion becomes. They get polarized. It becomes more extreme and perhaps even radical. The presence of others leads us to make bold decisions or actions, whereas if there were fewer people, we would be more cautious. And the answer to that is risky shift phenomenon. The risky shift is, the presence of others emboldens us. It makes us feel like bulletproof. People do crazy things, rash and dangerous things that they wouldn't normally do if the group were smaller or if they were by themselves. They're more likely to gamble, higher stakes. Finally, what could this be? Just being in the presence of others facilitates or boosts our performance on well-rehearsed tasks. And that, of course, is mere presence effect. Not to be confused with the mere exposure effect we mentioned earlier. Merely being in the presence of others. They don't even need to be watching, but merely being in the presence of others facilitates our performance on some tasks if they're well-rehearsed, if it's easier tasks or they're well-rehearsed. If they're difficult or challenging tasks or we're not well-rehearsed, we're not prepared for it, it actually will work the opposite. merely being in the presence of others might undermine your ability on that task. So that is it for Unit 1 and vocabulary. There's a lot of vocabulary here. I just want to say it's not just memorizing definitions, it's understanding deeply what each concept means to the point that you could actually come up with your own examples for each, because those real life application examples, it comes up a lot on tests and on the AP exam. See you later.